It was just a formal photo, but one man's hand reveals a terrifying secret. The basement smelled of mildew and forgotten time. Sarah Miller wiped dust from her hands as she sorted through her late aunt's belongings, boxes stacked like archaeological layers of family history. November rain drummed against the small window above, casting grey light across the cluttered space. She had been at this for 3 days now, finding little of value: old tax documents, faded receipts, broken picture frames. Then her fingers brushed against something solid, wrapped in oilcloth, at the bottom of a wooden trunk. Sarah carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a leather portfolio embossed with gold lettering. Hartwell Estate, 1889. Her breath caught. She had heard family stories about distant relatives who owned property in Mississippi after the Civil War, but she had never seen documentation. Inside the portfolio lay a single photograph, remarkably preserved in sepia tones. The image showed an imposing white mansion with tall columns and wraparound porches, quintessentially Southern in its grandeur. On the front steps stood a well-dressed white family, a stern patriarch with a thick mustache, his wife in an elaborate high-collared dress, and 3 children in formal attire. They stared directly at the camera with the rigid posture typical of 19th century photography. But it was the background that made Sarah lean closer. Behind the family, the grounds of the estate stretched out, and there, captured mid-labor, were black workers. Some carried bundles, others bent over what appeared to be cotton sacks. Unlike the posed family, these figures were frozen in natural motion, bodies angled away from the camera, their presence almost incidental to the portrait. Sarah felt a familiar unease. As a retired archivist who had spent 30 years preserving historical documents at the State Library, she had seen countless Reconstruction-era photographs. They always carried weight, always told stories beyond their surface. She set the photo on her makeshift workspace and snapped a high-resolution image. Back at her apartment, she would scan it properly, examine every detail. Something about this photograph felt significant, though she couldn't yet articulate why. The rain intensified outside as Sarah carefully rewrapped the portfolio. She had found something worth keeping, something worth understanding. She just didn't yet know how much this single image would consume her life in the coming months, or what terrible truth it would reveal. 3 days later, Sarah sat at her home office desk, the photograph displayed across her computer's large monitor. She had scanned it at maximum resolution, producing a digital file with extraordinary clarity. Modern technology could reveal details invisible in the past, especially in well-preserved 19th century photographs. She began with the family. Estate records revealed the patriarch was Augustus Hartwell. The 1890 census confirmed he owned a cotton plantation of nearly 800 acres in Issaquena County, Mississippi. His wife Eleanor and their children, 2 sons and a daughter, stared out from history with expressions of practiced dignity. But Sarah's attention kept drifting to the background. She zoomed in on the workers, counting 12 visible figures, all black men ranging from their late teens to perhaps around 50. Their clothes were simple, worn, nothing like the family's formal attire. Most looked away from the camera, as if instructed not to acknowledge it, or simply continuing their labor while the photographer immortalized the Hartwell family. Then she saw it. At the far right of the frame, partially obscured by the mansion's shadow, stood a man who appeared to be in his 30s. Unlike the others, he had turned slightly toward the camera, perhaps hearing the photographer's preparations. His face was blurred, but his right hand, extended downward, holding what might have been a tool or cloth, was captured with startling clarity. Sarah's stomach tightened. She zoomed in further, adjusting contrast and brightness. The man's hand was grotesquely deformed, fingers bent at unnatural angles, clearly broken and healed incorrectly. Dark discoloration covered the knuckles and palm, shadows suggesting old injuries, possibly burns or deep contusions. The thumb appeared to be missing entirely or folded inward, impossible to see from the angle. This was no single accident. This was repeated trauma, systematic, deliberate. Sarah's heart raced. She had archived thousands of photographs, but this felt wrong, intentionally buried behind elegance and pride. The Hartwells posed proudly before their grand home, while behind them stood silent evidence of cruelty. She needed to know more. She needed to know who this man was, what had happened to him, and why his suffering remained frozen behind a family portrait. For a week, Sarah immersed herself in research. Hartwell estate records, available through Mississippi Historical Archives, revealed the plantation operated from 1871 until 1923, when it was sold and subdivided. Augustus Hartwell had acquired the land shortly after Reconstruction, as wealthy former Confederates re-established power. But what disturbed Sarah most was the labor system documented in the plantation ledgers. After slavery was abolished, a new system replaced it: convict leasing and debt peonage. Black workers, arrested on trivial charges or trapped by predatory loans, were forced into labor contracts functioning as slavery by another name. The ledgers listed workers by first names only: Samuel Isaiah Moses Elijah Thomas. No surnames, no ages, no contracts, only occasional notes: injured, unable to work, left estate, deceased. Cross-referencing with county death records from 1880, 1900 brought Sarah no comfort, only horror. Dozens of black men, aged 15 to 50, died on or near the Hartwell property. Causes were vague: fever, accident, natural causes. No investigations, no inquests, just unmarked soil and silence. Yet one name appeared repeatedly: Dr. James Whitmore, the local physician. His official reports were sterile and unrevealing, but at the County Historical Society, Sarah found a clue. Whitmore had kept a private journal, donated by his grandson in 1967. She requested it via interlibrary loan. 2 weeks later, a leather-bound journal arrived. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. The entries, elegant cursive, spanned 1885 to 1903. She flipped page after page, searching for Hartwell, and then she found it. October 12, 1889, called again to Hartwell Plantation. Another worker with severe hand injuries, bones shattered. He claims it was a cotton gin accident, but the pattern suggests deliberate crushing. I set the bones as best I could, though he will never regain full use. This is the fourth such case this year. I fear what I'm witnessing, but who would believe me? Who would act? Sarah closed the journal, shaken. This was no speculation. This was evidence. But archives and records were not enough. She needed voices, descendants of those who lived this pain. Through genealogy databases and church records in Issaquah County, she identified 3 living residents linked to the plantation. The first was Reverend Marcus Thompson, age 87, whose great-grandfather worked at Hartwell in the 1880. Sarah drove 6 hours from her home in Memphis to the small Mississippi town where Reverend Thompson lived, in a modest house beside the church he had led for 40 years. He welcomed her onto his porch, his hands weathered but steady as he poured sweet tea. "My great-granddaddy's name was Isaiah," he told her, his voice carrying the weight of stories passed down through generations. He never talked much about those years, but my grandmother, his daughter, she remembered things he said near the end of his life. He told Sarah about the corrections. That was the word they used. Corrections. Sarah leaned forward. What did that mean? Reverend Thompson's eyes grew distant. When a man didn't pick his quota of cotton, or if he talked back or tried to leave, they would correct him. Sometimes it was whipping, like the old days, but sometimes it was far worse. Hands crushed in cotton gin machinery, staged as accidents. Fingers broken with hammers, reported as work injuries. A man with broken hands couldn't work, couldn't write, couldn't hold his children. It was about control. Fear. Did Isaiah have these injuries? Sarah asked quietly. He did. His right hand never worked proper. 3 fingers bent wrong. Couldn't straighten them. My grandmother said he taught himself to do everything left-handed. He lived to be 63, which was old for a black man who'd worked those plantations, but he carried those scars until he died. Sarah showed him the photograph on her tablet, zooming into the man with the deformed hand. Reverend Thompson studied it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Could be him, he said at last. Could be any of them, really. They all suffered. They all carried marks. He looked up at Sarah, eyes sharp, despite his age. You know the worst part? The white folks who did this, they took photographs, proud portraits in front of their big houses, and the broken men they destroyed were just background, just shadows, not even worth noticing. Sarah left Reverend Thompson's home with a heavy heart, but also with a growing determination. She had 2 more descendants to interview, and with each conversation, the truth was becoming undeniable. The second descendant was Loretta Washington, 79, whose great-uncle had been a contract laborer on the Hartwell estate. Loretta lived in Jackson in a small apartment filled with family photographs spanning 5 generations. She moved slowly, arthritis stiffening her joints, but her mind was sharp and her memory firm. My great-uncle Elijah came to the Hartwell place in 1887, she explained, settling into an armchair with a photo album on her lap. He'd been arrested for vagrancy, that's what they called it, when a black man was walking without a white person vouching for him. The judge gave him a choice, 6 months in jail or working off his fine on a plantation. He chose the work, thinking it would be better. It wasn't, Sarah asked, already expecting the answer. Loretta shook her head. Elijah wrote letters to his sister, Loretta's great-grandmother, who kept everyone. She taught herself to read, just so she could understand what he was saying. Loretta brought out a wooden box filled with yellowed pages, ink fading, but still legible. Sarah read them with growing horror. Elijah's early letters were hopeful. Hard work, long days, but bearable. By month 3, hope had drained from his words. He described impossible quotas, punishments for failing, men disappearing. One letter, dated August 1889, made Sarah's breath catch. Sister, I fear I will not leave this place whole. Yesterday Samuel spoke against the overseer for striking a boy no more than 16. They took Samuel to the barn. When he returned, his hands were wrapped in bloody rags. They say he caught them in the gin, but we all know the truth. They broke his fingers one by one with a mallet and made us watch. Did Elijah survive? Sarah whispered. He did, Loretta said softly. Barely. He worked there 3 years. They kept adding time to his contract for made-up infractions. When he finally got free in 1890, he had scars all over his back and his right hand was permanently damaged. He could never fully close it or hold anything tight. He became a preacher, said God spared him so he could testify. But he never spoke publicly about what happened. Too dangerous. Even decades later, those families still had power. Sarah photographed the letters with permission. The pattern was unmistakable now. Systematic torture disguised as workplace injury. A calculated strategy to control black laborers who had no legal voice, no escape. The third interview confirmed everything. James Carter, 82, whose grandfather escaped the Hartwell estate in 1891, described the same horrors: crippled men, disappeared workers, deaths labelled natural causes. Sarah now had testimony, letters, medical records, and the photograph itself. A mountain of truth. But she still didn't know the name of the man in the picture, the man whose broken hand began this journey. She returned to the Mississippi State Archives, this time requesting the personal papers of the Hartwell family, donated in 1952 by the last surviving grandchild. Most researchers overlooked them. Mundane correspondence, financial statements, property deeds. but truth often hides in what others ignore. For 2 days, she sifted through brittle papers, cotton price debates, furniture invoices, railroad contracts. Then, buried in a folder labeled Estate Management, 1888, 1890, she found the overseer's reports. Clayton Burke, overseer, submitted monthly summaries to Augustus Hartwell, labor statistics, crop yields, and disciplinary matters. The language was cold, clinical, torture disguised as management. September 1889, contract laborer. Samuel Thomas failed quota 3 consecutive days. Corrective measures applied. Subject's work capacity reduced, but example improved overall productivity by 12%. Sarah's stomach twisted. Then she saw it, an entry dated July 15th, 1889, 2 weeks before the photograph was taken. Contract laborer Moses Freeman attempted to leave estate without permission. Apprehended at county line. Standard correction applied to hands. Dr. Whitmore summoned. Freeman remains in service. Moses Freeman. She checked the plantation ledger. Contracted in 1886 over a $40 debt, unpayable at the wages listed. County records confirmed his death in 1893 at approximately 36 years old. Official cause, pneumonia. Only 4 years after the photo was taken. Sarah traced his family through scattered records, church registries, cemetery stones, census scraps. Moses had a wife, Clara, and 2 young children. Their path spread through Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, scattered survivors, rebuilding beyond the shadow of that plantation. At last, through persistent research and thin genealogical threads, she found a living descendant. Dr. Michael Freeman, retired professor of African American history, living in Atlanta. His great-great-grandfather was Moses Freeman. Sarah's hands shook as she composed an email to Dr. Michael S. Freeman, explaining her research and asking if he would be willing to speak with her. She hit send and waited, knowing this conversation could change everything. He responded within hours. His email was brief, but powerful. I have waited my entire life for someone to ask about my great-great-grandfather. When can we speak? They arranged a video call for the following evening. When Dr. Freeman's face appeared on Sarah's screen, she saw a distinguished man in his early 70s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Behind him stood walls lined with academic texts and framed family photographs. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice rich and deliberate, "you cannot know what your email meant to me. My great-great-grandfather, Moses Freeman, has been a ghost in my family's history. We knew his name, knew he suffered on a Mississippi plantation, but we had no details, no documentation, only oral stories that grew hazier with each generation." Sarah swallowed, her voice trembling. "I have documentation," she said softly, "and I have a photograph." She shared her screen, displaying the 1889 image of the Hartwell estate. Slowly, deliberately, she zoomed in. The Hartwell family posed proudly on the steps, then the line of laborers behind them, and finally the man in the far right corner with his twisted, broken hand. Dr. Freeman fell silent. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of inherited grief. "That's him. That's Moses." He told Sarah that his grandmother, Moses's granddaughter, had described him when he was a child. She said he had kind eyes but broken hands, that he could barely hold his newborn daughter because his fingers wouldn't bend, that he died young, worn down by work, by pain, by cruelty. Sarah then showed him everything, the overseer's report, the medical ledger, the death certificate. Dr. Freeman listened in silence, wiping his eyes as the fractured history of his family finally began to take shape. "My entire academic career has been about recovering lost stories," he said quietly. "I have written 3 books on Reconstruction and debt peonage. I have taught thousands of students, but I never had proof of my own family's story. Do you know what you've given me?" "I know what Moses Freeman gave us," Sarah replied. "He was not just a victim. He was a human being. His suffering was photographed, documented, preserved. Now it can be spoken." Dr. Freeman leaned forward. "What do you plan to do with this research?" Sarah had thought about this moment often. "I want to publish it. Academic journals, historical societies, museum exhibitions. These stories need names, evidence, faces. Moses deserves to be remembered." "Then I want to help you," Dr. Freeman said. "I have contacts, resources, graduate researchers. Together we can make sure Moses Freeman and the men who suffered beside him are never erased again." They spoke for 2 more hours, outlining a partnership that would merge Sarah's archival discoveries with Dr. Freeman's academic authority. Their goal was ambitious: a comprehensive historical record, a traveling exhibition, and public acknowledgement of the atrocities committed at the Hartwell estate and plantations across the South. That night, as the call ended, Sarah felt something inside her shift. This was no longer research. It was responsibility, a moral inheritance. Word of her work began spreading through universities and historical networks. Most responses were supportive, even excited. Scholars of Reconstruction understood the magnitude, confirmed evidence of systematic torture tied to names, places, dates, but not everyone welcomed the truth. 3 months into their collaboration, Sarah received a certified letter from an attorney representing the Hartwell Family Historical Foundation. Established in 1975 to preserve the Hartwell legacy, the foundation maintained a plantation museum depicting the Hartwells as benevolent landowners who helped rebuild the post-war South. The letter was polite, professionally worded, but unmistakably threatening. It requested that Sarah cease using the Hartwell name and implied that her unsubstantiated allegations could constitute defamation. It hinted at legal action. When Sarah showed Dr. Freeman the letter, he gave a humorless laugh. Classic intimidation. Wealthy families sanitize history. They rewrite, reframe, erase. They turn enslavers into gentlemen and torture into labor discipline. They don't want witnesses. They don't want names. "Can they stop us?" Sarah asked. "Not if our evidence is sound, and it is." His voice hardened. "But they can fight us. They can pressure publishers. They can bury the truth under noise. So, we prepare." Together they built a larger coalition. Dr. Freeman contacted respected historians across major universities. Sarah reached out to investigative journalists known for exposing historical injustice. Their support network grew strong, too public to silence quietly. Meanwhile, Sarah made a discovery that stunned even her. In the Hartwell family letters, she found a document dated October 1889, written by Augustus Hartwell himself. In it, he described the family portrait session. Some contract workers were visible in the background, but the photographer assured me they would not distract from the composition. I paid extra to ensure the focus remained on the family. It is important that our prosperity be recorded for future generations. He knew. He saw the laborers behind him. He simply did not care. Their presence was scenery, no more human to him than the porch steps. This letter became the center of Sarah's research. It didn't just confirm cruelty, it revealed mindset. A worldview in which black suffering was so ordinary, so unimportant, it could be photographed and still go unseen. When Sarah showed Dr. Freeman the letter, he sat still for a long time before speaking. "This is why we do the work," he said. "Because the mindset that erased Moses did not die in 1889. It lives in silence. When we speak his name, when we show the records, we are refusing to let history bury him." Sarah nodded. They would publish. They would exhibit. They would not be stopped. 6 months after first finding the photograph, Sarah and Dr. Freeman presented their findings at the Southern Historical Association conference. The auditorium was packed. Word had spread about their findings, and historians were eager to see the evidence. Sarah began with the photograph, projected large on the screen behind her. She let the audience absorb the image: the proud Hartwell family, the grand mansion, the workers in the background. Then she zoomed in on Moses Freeman's hand, the deformed fingers impossible to ignore once attention was drawn to them. This photograph was taken in August 1889, Sarah explained, her voice steady despite her nerves. At first glance, it appears to be a simple family portrait, a record of prosperity and status. But if we look closer, if we see what the photographer and the Hartwell family chose to ignore, we find evidence of a brutal system of violence and control that defined the post-Reconstruction South. She walked the audience through her research: the overseer's reports, Dr. Whitmore's journal, the testimony of descendants, the death records, the patterns of systematic torture disguised as workplace accidents. Dr. Freeman followed with historical context, explaining debt peonage, convict leasing, and the legal frameworks that enabled the continuation of slavery under different names. They named names: Moses Freeman, Isaiah Thompson, Elijah Washington, Samuel Thomas. Men who had been erased from official histories, reduced to ledger entries and vague death certificates, but who had lived, suffered, and deserved to be remembered. The response was powerful. Other historians shared similar findings from different plantations and different states. A pattern emerged. What happened on the Hartwell estate was not an isolated incident, but part of a widespread system of post-Civil War terror and exploitation that had been minimized or ignored in mainstream historical narratives. Within weeks, major newspapers picked up the story. The photograph went viral on social media, shared thousands of times with commentary about hidden histories and the importance of looking closely at seemingly innocent images from the past. Museums and educational institutions contacted Sarah and Dr. Freeman about creating exhibitions based on their research. But the most meaningful response came from descendants. More than 30 people reached out, sharing family stories about ancestors who had worked on the Hartwell estate or similar plantations. Each story added another layer to the narrative, another name to remember, another life to honor. One woman, Patricia Coleman, sent Sarah a photograph of her great-great-grandfather taken around 1900. He stood in his Sunday best, one hand resting on a Bible, the other carefully positioned to hide fingers that bent at wrong angles. My family. Always said he hurt his hand in an accident, Patricia wrote. But after seeing your research, I understand it wasn't an accident at all. Thank you for giving me the truth. The Hartwell Family Historical Foundation eventually issued a statement. It acknowledged that regrettable labor practices may have occurred on the estate, but stopped short of admitting systematic torture or taking responsibility for their ancestors' actions. It was inadequate, but it was something. A crack in the wall of denial. Sarah stood in her office, surrounded by the documents and photographs that had consumed her life for nearly a year. She thought about Moses Freeman, about his broken hands and his stolen life, about how close his story had come to being lost forever. She thought about the power of one photograph, one detail, one person willing to look closely and care enough to investigate. History, she realized, was not just about the past. It was about the present, about choosing to see what had been hidden, to name what had been silenced, to remember what others wanted forgotten. 1 year after finding the photograph, Sarah stood in a cemetery in Esquina County, Mississippi. It was a small, mostly forgotten burial ground on what had once been the Hartwell estate. The land had been sold and subdivided decades ago, but this plot, where contract laborers had been buried in unmarked graves, had been preserved by local activists who fought to protect it. Beside her stood Dr. Michael Freeman, Reverend Marcus Thompson, Loretta Washington, and dozens of other descendants of men who had worked on the plantation. They had gathered for a memorial ceremony, the first formal recognition these men had ever received. A local mason had created a monument, a simple but dignified granite stone engraved with the names they had recovered. Moses Freeman, Isaiah Thompson, Elijah Washington, Samuel Thomas, and 37 others identified through Sarah's research. Beneath the names was an inscription: Workers on the Hartwell Estate, 1871-1923. Forced into servitude, subjected to cruelty, denied justice in life, remembered and honored in death. Dr. Freeman spoke first, his voice carrying across the small gathering. For more than a century, these men existed only as shadows in the background of someone else's photograph, as footnotes in ledgers, as anonymous entries in death records. Today, we bring them into the light. We name them. We honor them. We insist that their lives mattered and their suffering was real. Reverend Thompson offered a prayer, his words mixing grief with hope. Loretta Washington read from her great-uncle Elijah's letters, her voice breaking as she shared his words across the span of more than 100 years. Then Sarah stepped forward, holding the original 1889 photograph in a protective sleeve. She had donated it to the newly created Hartwell Estate Memorial Project, but brought it here one last time. This photograph almost remained hidden forever, she said softly. It almost stayed in a basement, forgotten, its secrets buried with the men it accidentally captured. But Moses Freeman's broken hand, visible in the background of a family's proud portrait, refused to be erased. It survived as evidence, as testimony, as a bridge between his world and ours. She placed the photograph beside the monument so everyone could see it. The grand house, the posed family, the workers behind them, and Moses Freeman's damaged hand. We cannot undo what was done, Sarah continued. We cannot give these men back their stolen years, their broken bodies, their lost futures. But we can do this. We can remember. We can tell their stories. We can insist that history acknowledge them, not as background scenery in someone else's picture, but as human beings who endured, who resisted, who loved, who hoped. As the ceremony ended, people stepped forward, touching the stone, leaving flowers, standing in silence. Some took photographs, not to celebrate wealth or power, but to document remembrance, a refusal to forget. Sarah looked at the crowd, at the sun breaking through the clouds, at the names carved into stone. She thought about the journey from the dusty basement where the photograph had rested to this reclaimed burial ground. She thought about how many photographs still sat in attics and archives across the country. How many stories were still waiting to be seen. One photograph, one hand, one life. And at last, the world had listened.